Today we will learn and reflect on the role of the 30 Tyrants of Athens, whose rule was enabled by the Spartan commander Lysander after Sparta won the Peloponnesian Wars by destroying the Athenian fleet. And we draw from many ancient sources, including Xenophon and Plutarch and Thucydides and Plato and Diodorus Siculus and Aristotle's student in the Athenian constitution. We will reflect on how these events influenced the Platonic dialogues, especially those that reflect on the trial and execution of Socrates. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script posted as SlideShare. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. After the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, the victorious Spartan commander Lysander insisted that as part of the terms of the peace, the Athenians set up an aristocracy under the rule of the 30 Tyrants. Although the previous tyrants in the 6th century BC were benevolent tyrants, the 30 Tyrants were tyrants of the worst kind, dominated by the vicious Critias, a tyranny that quickly descended into an orgy of bloodshed directed first against their enemies and then against their fellow aristocrats so they could seize their property. This misrule preceded the reestablishment of the Radical Democracy of Athens, and the events of the 30 Tyrants cast a long shadow over Athenian history and the Platonic dialogues. Now first we want to summarize the main events of the Peloponnesian Wars. These wars followed the Greco-Persian Wars by about 50 years. We reflected on the period between the Greco-Persian Wars and up to the life and career of the Athenian statesman Pericles, up through his death by the plague in the second year of the first phase of the Peloponnesian Wars. After the war-hawk generals of both Athens and Sparta were killed in battle, Nicias negotiated the Peace of Nicias, which, although it was not very peaceful, it did end direct hostilities between Athens and Sparta for nearly 7 years. But the Peace of Nicias was broken when Athens launched the doomed Sicilian expedition. When the Syracusans defeated the dilatory and timid Nicias, the Athenians lost everything: 200 triremes, hoplites, rowers, even generals, including Nicias and Demosthenes, were destroyed and slain. Very few escaped, and Sparta restarted the war in response to Athenian aggression and her loss in Sicily. After this defeat, Athens struggled, but the Spartan fleet was not able to take full advantage of her weakened position. In the oligarchic coup, the aristocrats coaxed the Athenian assembly to abolish itself and permit an oligarchy of the 400 to assume control of the government, reasoning this may attract Persian aid, and promising to hand the government over to a more representative body of the 5,000 at that time. Also at this time, Alcibiades engineered a comeback and assumed command of the Athenian fleet at Samos. The oligarchs of the 400 ruled for about 4 months. The Persian aid did not materialize, and Alcibiades called their bluff, calling for the rule of the 5,000, which ended the rule by the Athenian oligarchs. Many scholars believe that Alcibiades initially supported the oligarchic coup, but then double-crossed the aristocrats when it became politically expedient for him to do so. The Athenians put great hope in Alcibiades when the fleet of Athens, under his leadership, enjoyed a 5-year run of victories. But after a minor tactical defeat, Alcibiades was deprived of his command for a second time, choosing to go into exile. The Athenians continued to be victorious. Sometime afterwards, the Athenian generals won a great victory in the Battle of Arginusae, but in the chaos of battle, they failed to expeditiously rescue many Athenian rowers who were clinging to the wreckage of their triremes. Suddenly, a fierce storm arose, and not only were the men drowned, but their bodies were swept out to sea and were not recovered. Acting in haste, the Athenian assembly executed 6 of the 10 generals for failing to save these rowers or recover their bodies, even though they had won a great victory. These proceedings were illegal because the generals were tried simultaneously by the assembly, not in individual jury trials, and were denied sufficient time to defend themselves. The inexperienced generals replacing them lost the war to the Spartan general Lysander when their carelessness permitted the enemy to destroy the Athenian fleet of 200 triremes on the beaches. So after the war, the Sparta forces Athens to adopt an oligarchy of the 30 Tyrants. And during the Peloponnesian Wars, the Spartans encouraged or forced her allies or the city-states she conquered to establish oligarchies or rule by the upper classes. Likewise, the Athenians encouraged or forced her allies or the city-states she conquered to establish radical democracy, where all male citizens were granted the right to vote in the assembly. Now that Sparta had defeated Athens, they forced the Athenians to accept the rule of the 30 Tyrants. When the early Platonic dialogues were written, the memory of the misrule of the 30 Tyrants was still vivid in the minds of many Athenians. Resentments from this period affected the trial and execution of Socrates, and several of these tyrants were mentioned in the Platonic dialogues. Xenophon remembers, the oligarchy came to power when the assembly decided that 30 men should be elected to codify the ancient laws as a basis for a new constitution. After their election, Lysander sailed off to Samos, and King Agis withdrew his forces from the Decelea, allowing them to return home. And Xenophon then lists the 30 tyrants. Most only appear in this list and are not mentioned in either Thucydides or Xenophon's history before they appear in this roster. Some of these minor figures likely served as generals or fought during the war, but they're not mentioned by these historians. Now, the 30 tyrants that do have some prior mentions in Thucydides or Xenophon, or who are mentioned by Dr. Wikipedia, perhaps they're included in a Platonic dialogue, include Cleomedes, who was an Athenian general during the destruction of Melos following the infamous Melian dialogue, when the Athenian forces slaughtered the military-aged men of Melos and enslaved their women and children, which was common practice in the ancient world, but it was still seen as very brutal at the time and very controversial in Athens itself. And we also have Charicles and Onomacles, and they were Athenian generals who served after the Sicilian expedition. Aristoteles, not to be confused with Aristotle, was a member of the 400 oligarchs, although he was not mentioned by Thucydides, and was a character in Plato's dialogue, Parmenides. And the second part of this dialogue is between him and the 19-year-old Socrates, so we're definitely going to study that dialogue pretty soon. And this philosophical discussion was the subject of commentaries by the Neoplatonists. And finally, Critias and Theramenes were the two major leaders of the 30 Tyrants. Critias became known as the Robespierre of ancient Greece. His former friend Theramenes fell victim in the early rounds of his bloody executions. Now, Critias is not mentioned by either Thucydides or Xenophon before he appears in the list of 30 tyrants. Although he was the most infamous student of Socrates, Critias had a strained relationship with him, although Critias may have saved the life of his former teacher during the terror of the 30 tyrants. He was killed in the battle with Thrasybulus that preceded the end of the rule of the 30 tyrants. And Critias appears as a character in Plato's dialogue, Charmides and Protagoras, and was probably Plato's great uncle. Critias himself was also the author of many plays, although only passages survive in fragments. Theramenes was the leader both of the 400 oligarchy before the end of the war and helped negotiate the final peace with Sparta at the end of the war prior to the 30 tyrants. Theramenes and Thrasybulus would lead the opposition to the 30 tyrants. Both served as ship captains under Alcibiades, and in the Battle of Arginusae were unable to rescue rowers from drowning when a fierce storm suddenly arose, which swept their bodies out to sea. Now, to understand the role of Theramenes in the history of the 30 tyrants, we want to reflect on the leading role he played in the aristocratic government of the 400. Now, Theramenes was the junior member of the 4 aristocrats who founded the rule of the 400. After Athens suffered a defeat, the 400 oligarchs were overthrown and the 5,000 were appointed from the hoplite class. And the leaders of this revolt were Aristocrates and Theramenes, and they were dissatisfied that the 400 did everything on their own and referred nothing to the 5,000. And this moderation by Theramenes would lead to his demise in the rule of the 30 tyrants after the war. Now, we will continue our reflection on the rule of the 30 tyrants. Aristotle's student says that after Lysander became master of Athens, peace had been made on the condition that the Athenians should live under their traditional constitution. Some Athenians preferred a democracy, and many aristocrats favored an oligarchy, but their particular champion was Theramenes. Lysander gave his support to the oligarchs, and the people were intimidated and compelled to support the oligarchy at the point of the sword. An Aristotle student notes that at first the 30 tyrants governed moderately. Xenophon remembers, although the 30 were elected to frame laws for the new constitution, they delayed. No laws were framed or published, and meanwhile they had appointed members of the council and other magistrates just as they saw fit. Their first measure was to arrest and put on trial for their lives all who were informers during the democracy and had attacked the aristocrats. The council was glad to condemn these people to death, and members of the public were too intimidated to object. Next, however, the 30 began to consider how they could get the power to do exactly what they wanted with the state. The 30 tyrants sought Spartan assistance to prop up their brutal regime, and Lysander agreed with their requests, and sent a garrison with Calibus to act as governor of Athens. After these Spartans arrived, the 30 tyrants began to arrest all whom they wished to arrest, which were those who were the least likely to submit to being pushed out of politics. Critias and Tyrants were the leaders of the 30 tyrants. Xenophon remembers. At first, Critias and Tyrants shared the same views and were personal friends. But when Critias began to show a lust for putting people to death, Tyrants opposed him. There is no sense, he said, in putting a man to death simply because he's been honored by the democracy when he has done the aristocracy no harm. After all, both you and I have often sought popularity with the citizens. And Xenophon remembers. Critias was still friendly with Tyrants. Critias said, "It is quite impossible for those who want to gain power to avoid getting rid of those people who are most likely to form an opposition. And it is pure simplicity on your part if you think that, just because we are 30 and not one, we have to keep a less close watch on the government than is done by an absolute dictator." Now the 30 tyrants became concerned and held a review under arms, seizing the weapons of all who were not among the list of 3,000 citizens. Xenophon tells us, once this was done, the tyrants were free to act exactly as they wished. They began to put people to death in great numbers, some because they were personal enemies, some for the sake of their money. It was necessary to pay the Spartan garrison, so they decided that each of them should arrest one of the resident aliens, put him to death, and confiscate his property to pay the Spartans. Tyrants objected. Are we, in order to get money, going to kill people who've done nothing wrong? Is not this worse in every way? The 30 now came to regard Tyrants as an obstacle in the way of their complete liberty to do as they liked, and so they began to intrigue against him. The 30 tyrants had only been in power for a few months, but already the hands of Critias were soaked in as much blood as was the hands of Robespierre, several years into the French Revolution, who ordered so many citizens to the guillotine. The rule of the 30 tyrants and the French Revolution many centuries later devoured both its enemies and its children. Of course, though both revolutions were quite bloody, the major difference is that the aristocratic 30 tyrants opposed the radical democracy, while the Democrats of the French Revolution opposed the monarchy and the aristocracy. Another very important difference to us is that there are very few paintings of the 30 tyrants, while thankfully there are plentiful paintings of the French Revolution. Now Xenophon tells us, when Tyrants appeared at the council, Critias rose to his feet and said, "Gentlemen of the council, if there's anyone here who has the impression that more people are being put to death than is warranted, I ask him to reflect that, in periods of revolution, this always happens. It is inevitable that we, who are setting up an oligarchy in Athens, should be vigorously opposed, both because the state is the most highly populated in Greece, and because Athenians have been brought up in freedom for a longer time than any other people." Critias continues, that for men like us, democracy is oppressive. We realize that while democracy could never be friends with our preservers, the Spartans, the aristocrats would always be loyal to them. Therefore, with the full approval of Sparta, we are setting up the present system of government. If we find anyone opposed to the oligarchy, we will do our best to get rid of him. If we find that one of us is interfering with the order we have set up, we consider it right and proper that he should be punished. Critias concludes, I say therefore that Tyrants should be punished not only as an enemy, but as a traitor to you and to us. We have much more horror of a traitor than an enemy, since it is harder to guard against hidden dangers than open ones. And we hate traitors more than enemies, since with our enemies we can make peace and become friends again. But when we find that we've been betrayed by someone, we can never, under any circumstances, make peace with him. We can never trust them again. To allow Tyrants to remain alive would be to encourage the ambitions of our opponents. But to destroy him would mean cutting short the hopes of all our enemies. Tyrants first defends himself and then responds. Let me tell you, Critias, that the men who strengthen the opposition are not those who prevent one from making a lot of enemies and who show how to gain the most friends. Far from it. It is the people who confiscate property illegally and put the innocent to death who are increasing the opposition and acting as traitors both to their friends and to themselves, all for the sake of dishonest gain. The oligarchy was set up to satisfy the victorious Spartans, but Theramenes also says this about his enemies. They sought to let the enemy in and so gain control of the state for themselves and their friends. I saw what was going on and I put a stop to it. Do you call this being a traitor to one's friends? And the applause that followed this reply by Theramenes made Critias realize that he would lose any vote to condemn Theramenes. He stated that though the new laws protected anyone on the list of 3,000 from a death sentence, that the 30 also had the power to strike anyone from the list. So he struck off the name of Theramenes and condemned him to death. The other council members feared to object, since Critias had troops and men with daggers in the council room. And as an aside, we want to note that Socrates protested injustice during the time of the 30 Tyrants. The history of the Peloponnesian Wars and the 30 Tyrants who assumed power after the war casts a long shadow over Athens and the Platonic dialogues. And we want to point out that Socrates did publicly object, at the risk of losing his life, to the injustices of these times. We found this excellent summary from Will Durant on why Anytus was one of the Athenian citizens who brought charges against Socrates. Anytus could not forget that when he went into exile, likely when he opposed the tyrants, his son stayed in Athens with Socrates and became a drunkard. And the fact that Socrates refused to obey the 30 tyrants did not matter. To Anytus it seemed that Socrates, more than any sophist, was an evil influence both on morals and on politics. He was undermining the religious faith that had supported morality, and his persistent criticism was weakening the belief of educated Athens in the institution of democracy. In other words, Socrates was suspect because he was a gadfly. The murderous tyrant Critias had been one of Socrates' students, and the immoral and treasonable Alcibiades had been his lover, and Charmides, his early favorite, had been a general under Critias. It seemed fitting that Socrates should leave Athens or die. And the charges brought against Socrates were that he did not recognize the gods of Athens, trusting rather in his personal daemon, and that he corrupted the youth of Athens. Now, Diodorus Siculus reports that when Theramenes was publicly condemned, Socrates the philosopher and two of his intimates ran forward and tried to hinder the attendants who were the appointed executioners. But Theramenes entreated them to do nothing of the kind. He appreciated, he said, their friendship and bravery. But as for himself, it would be the greatest grief if he should be the cause of the death of those who were so intimately associated with him. So Socrates and his helpers, since they had no aid from anyone else and saw the intransigence of those in authority increasing, made no move. Now Plato's Socrates, in his defense speech in the Dialogues, recalls how he objected to the brutality of the rule of the 30 Tyrants. I, Socrates, and 4 others were instructed to bring Leon from Salamis to the Rotunda so that he could be put to death. And the tyrants gave this command to implicate as many as possible in their crime. And Socrates insisted, I did not give a damn about my death. My great and only care was not to do an unrighteous or unholy thing. The strong arm of their oppressive power did not frighten me into doing wrong. Rather than participate, Socrates went quietly home, for which I might have lost my life, had not the power of the 30 shortly afterwards come to an end. Likewise, Socrates reminds the Athenian jury in his defense speech that he was the only one who objected to the illegal irregularities in the trial and unjust execution of the generals who fought in the Battle of Arcanusae. And Socrates remembered, when the orators threatened to impeach and arrest me, and you called and shouted, I made up my mind that I would run the risk, having law and justice with me, rather than take part in your injustice for the fear of imprisonment and death. So, another question. Was Socrates responsible for the actions of his 2 most famous students, the outrageous Alcibiades and the bloodthirsty tyrant Critias? Now Xenophon asks, how can it be the fault of a teacher of moral philosophy if one of his students, though he was living a somewhat moral life under the tutelage of his teacher, later falls in with the wrong crowd, goes astray, and later leads an immoral life? How can that be the fault of the teacher? In the Memoirs of Socrates, Xenophon admits that Critias and Alcibiades did more to harm their country than anyone else. Critias was the most avaricious and violent of the oligarchs, while Alcibiades became the most dissolute and arrogant of the democrats. These 2 men were by nature the most ambitious persons in all Athens. determined to have personal control over all state affairs and to be famous above all others. And this led to hubris and loosening of morals that led both to their downfall and the defeat of Athens. Xenophon describes their fall from truth taught them by Socrates. My opinion that if God had offered them the choice between living their lives as Socrates did and dying, they would have preferred to die, because they both broke with Socrates and entered politics. Xenophon concedes that the critics might be right who say that Socrates should not have taught them politics before he taught them self-discipline. Now, Plato's Socrates is more of a metaphysical philosopher, whereas Xenophon's Socrates is a simpler moral philosopher. And as he reflects on how these two students went astray, Xenophon compares the life of an athlete to the moral life. Just as those who do not exercise their bodies cannot carry out their physical duties, so those who do not exercise their characters cannot carry out their moral duties. Self-discipline must be practiced continually. It is like a muscle that needs exercising. History, as far as I know, is silent on whether Alcibiades had any contact with Socrates after his first exile at the time of the Sicilian expedition. Regarding Critias, there were many private and public conflicts. There were tensions between them even when he was a student. Critias resented rather than learned from Socrates' criticisms of his conduct. When he was a tyrant, Critias introduced a law against teaching the art of debate, which was directed against Socrates. And Critias forbade Socrates from even talking to the youth of Athens and warned him against bothering people in the marketplace with his endless moral questioning. Again, Critias is faulting Socrates for being the gadfly of Athens. Critias's criticisms of Socrates were similar to the charges that were brought against him in his trial and subsequent execution after the Radical Democracy was reestablished. So now we'll get back to the history of the 30 Tyrants and how they were overthrown. The blood of innocent citizens flowed quicker and thicker after the execution of Theramenes. About 1,500 Democrats were killed and over 5,000 were exiled. Athenians lost their freedom to teach and their right to peaceable assembly and were forbidden to speak freely. Diodorus Siculus reports, after the death of Theramenes, the 30 drew up a list of the wealthy, lodged false charges against them, put them to death, and seized their estates. The madness of the tyrants led them to slaughter 60 of the wealthiest in order to steal their property. And as for the citizens, since they were being killed daily, the well-to-do among them fled from the city almost to a man, and more than half of the Athenians fled. Now many Athenians, including Thrasybulus with 700 fighting men, sought refuge in Thebes and other neighboring city-states. They left Thebes and seized the strong fortress of Philae. Their forces, assisted by the Spartans, defeated troops sent out by the 30 Tyrants, 2 of whom, including Critias, were killed in battle. Now after this short battle, the two sides of Athenians started conversing. The speech of one herald included this plea, "Do not give your obedience to these wicked men, the 30, who for their own private profit have in 8 months come close to killing more Athenians than did all the Peloponnesians in 10 years of war." Which was probably an exaggeration, but there was quite a considerable number of Athenians executed by the 30 Tyrants. And Plutarch reports in his Life of Lysander that the 2 Spartan kings were concerned that Lysander was the sovereign lord of Greece, and that his friends and partisans possessed many cities in Greece. While Lysander was on his voyage to Egypt, the kings restored the power to the people and threw his friends out. When Lysander heard of the disturbances opposing the 30 Tyrants in Athens, he hurried back to assist them. But the kings, envying Lysander, fearing that he should take Athens again, resolved that one of them should take command. So King Pausanias, although posing as a tyrant, in reality promoted peace, so that Lysander might not, by means of his friends, become lord of Athens again. This was easily accomplished. When he reconciled the Athenians, he quieted the tumults and defeated the ambitious hope of Lysander. After these battles, the Spartan assembly offered an agreement that the Athenians be at peace with each other, and that everyone should return to his home except for the 30 and other top leaders. The aristocratic rebel Thrasybulus said this in his speech to his fellow Athenians: "This is the advice I wish to give to the men of the city. Know yourselves." And this was also inscribed on the outside of the temple of the oracle at Delphi. Continuing with the speech, "Ask what right you have to be so arrogant to attempt to make us your subjects. Are you morally better? Then why is it that the common people, though poorer than you, never did you any harm for the sake of money, whereas you, who are richer than all of them, have committed many disgraceful crimes for the sake of your own profit. Now, Xenophon does not report that the radical democracy was reestablished in Athens immediately after the 30 tyrants were defeated. We must assume that the remaining tyrants were much less tyrannical, especially since the ringleader Critias was in the underworld. But Plutarch also reports that shortly thereafter, the Athenians rebelled again, and Pausanias was censured for having taken the bit out of the mouth of the people. Freed from the oligarchy, the people would now break out into affronts and insolence, and Lysander regained the reputation of a person who employed his command not in gratification for others, not for applause, but strictly for the good of Sparta. But he would not be allowed to command the forces against Athens again, which meant that Sparta was compelled to tolerate the reestablishment of the radical democracy of Athens. Lysander did not pose a threat for long, since he soon died in combat in Boeotia. So, how did Athens fare after the war? Displaying resilience, she regained her financial position, rebuilt a smaller fleet in her fortifications with Persian assistance, regained control over a few colonies, formed a weak naval league, and was one of the 4 allies battling Sparta in the Corinthian War that broke out in the next decade. However, never again would Athens be the hegemon dominating the Greek world. Instead, she would evolve into the Greek cultural center university town she would become in the later Roman Empire. And now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. And our primary sources for this video are Plutarch's Life of Lysander and the histories by Thucydides and Xenophon, and also Diodorus Siculus, and he retold an incident between Socrates and the 30 Tyrants. Since all our videos on the Peloponnesian Wars use many of the same sources, we also have a video on the book reviews of ancient Greek history and philosophy. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.